say it without tearing up, so I'll stop. I am a woman. I am not a man of yellow leaf. I'm some kind of Asian woman that's not yellow yet. Okay. I just want to tell you that you mentioned Jerry Murphy. I taught that this semester to some of my undergrads in the English department, and we voted on the different periods and which ones seemed most relevant to revive pedagogically, and the medieval period won because of his chapter in that book. So the medieval period in rhetoric is not dead. You thought it was, but it's not. Okay. All right, I have lots of connections with what you said, but I want to speak about rhetoric from a very different perspective, perhaps. I'm in the English department, as I mentioned, and for me, rhetoric has always been about community building in some way or another. From the ancient polis, if we hadn't had rhetoric, we couldn't have organized, or they, not me, them, couldn't have organized the Greek city-states, the Romans, whatever, all of their empire, all the things out of which the rhetorical canon came. But for me, it was, when I looked at it as a Southern woman who knew nothing about classical history, it was about building community and building civilized societies that were literate. And that's what was interesting to me, literate, civilized societies. It's also been about teaching from the very beginning. You cannot look at classical rhetoric without seeing pedagogy. It's everywhere. It's what Aristotle did. It's what Plato talked about. It's what the canon is about, the Cicero, Quintilian. I love Quintilian. Some of you already know this. You've heard too much about Quintilian and his teaching practices. But for me, the history of rhetoric, the canonical history, is about teaching, which I care passionately about. It's, law. You can't go to law school without knowing rhetoric, either intuitively or directly, because that's what those people who were organizing communities were trying to establish, a way to run their states or their cities efficiently and effectively. So it all sounds really good and, something that everybody should study, and it's also really, really bad. Rhetoric has a dark side. Rhetoric can be used to dominate. It has from its very beginning been a tool of domination, and it still is today. So I think it's one of the most important things that you can study. If you want to think about what's influencing you, what's dominating you, whether it's media, whether it's whatever it is, rhetoric is at the heart of it. That's what's making you a victim in some ways if you don't know about it. However, let's go back to some good stuff. It's robust and ever-evolving methodologies have been applied to everything from, here's a long list, the nature of persuasion, literacy, nationhood, race, class, gender, digital media, the body, pedagogical practice, doubt, and skepticism. That's just a short list. If you looked at the dissertation titles of people who've come before the graduate students in this room and the dissertation titles that they're thinking about, it's the rhetoric of X, Y, and Z, because they get it, that it's important to understand the persuasive strategies that are at work at whatever they're interested in examining. Rhetoric in the English department has also always been about these things, but my first memory of rhetoric in the English department in Allen Hall was a cold chill that went from my neck down to the base of my spine. And it came when I joined the faculty in 2004, and I'd been in a cold place, the University of Minnesota, so I wasn't expecting to get a cold chill in Allen Hall. But as I realized, what happened was that I realized that my office was just a few feet away from the one occupied by Cleanth Brooks, and if you've just heard about Cleanth Brooks, and there's a little plaque on the wall, and I have to walk by it every day, and I have a little mini turn when I feel that chill. I'll tell you what in a minute. And then my office is adjacent to the Robert Penn Warren seminar room. So this drove me to dig out this thing, the Well-Wrought Urn by Cleanth Brooks, which was one of the things I was forced to deal with as an undergraduate in the throes of new criticism and all of those people that came out of here. I was at Florida State, which was different, but we were heavily influenced by what was happening here and what had happened here. So modern rhetoric by Brooks and Warren and the Well-Wrought Urn by Cleanth Brooks were sort of the foundation for what English majors were taught to do, even as late as the 60s when and I was there. Great time in school. As an undergraduate, I learned my first lessons from these kinds of things. And I also want to point out that Brooks and Warren were one of the greatest collaborative teams and other people that they collaborated with. They weren't stuck with the idea of the individual author. They worked together in teams to do things that they wanted to. And as we move into the middle part of the 21st century, I think we're going to see more and more of that, returning even to academia, which is slow to change. Famous collaborative relationships, they represent to me English professors who cared enough to write about pedagogy. So even though I get a cold chill from some of their practices and their conservative views, on and on, I could tell you more of their dark side too, and I'm sure Andy knows it up close and personal. But for me, they do represent English professors who cared enough to write about pedagogy and to think about what they were doing with students. So it's no surprise that our gateway course in the undergraduate concentration in English, Rhetoric, Writing, and Culture is a course called Interpreting Discourse. And I love to teach that course. I think there are probably other people in the room who've taught it, because it gives students a set of tools to open up meanings in new ways and from different perspectives, and sometimes not from the dominant perspective, which is always my goal. I'm quite sure, by the way, we just preserved that concentration in the English department. There was some discussion about just having one big English major, and that might have been okay too, but we've decided to keep it visible. We've decided to keep rhetoric highly visible even for our undergraduates. And so I was just thinking about what Brooks and Warren would think about that. And I was thinking, would they have been for that, or would they have wanted everything folded into literature? And the answer was a no-brainer. They would have wanted everything folded into literature, because that's all they cared about, really, as something to study. But then I had this fantasy about how, if they had continued to grow intellectually, and they were now 100 and what years old, they would, no, I didn't mean to look at you. I'm close to 100, but not as close. So I was thinking about what Brooks and Warren would think about having rhetoric survive and not be thrown into the soup with all of the other things that literature scholars do. And I think if they continue to expand their textual horizons, that they might really be on board with all of this, because they did understand rhetoric. They understood how text changed. They understood internally how texts work. Way too much. I studied Robert Burns' poem, one Robert Burns poem for 6 weeks in my horrible poetry class. Because that's what we did. We went deeply in. We studied the etymologies of every word. It's awful. So they would have continued to progress, and I think that they'd be all for rhetoric and digital literacy, which is where I'm going in just a minute. We've got Brooks and Warren on our team, and I couldn't find modern rhetoric, but I could find the well-wrought urn, which is great, because at Andy's farm, I just volunteered to teach pottery in his farm. Yes. The well-wrought urn, get it? Yeah. There is a connection. All right, so I think they'd have a different view if they had time to understand the rich body of nonfiction texts that we have to work with, the post-print possibilities for multimodal texts, and how important it is that we understand these new forms of media as we enter into what a lot of people, even in the English department, are calling the post-print world. So what's it going to be like? How are we going to be communicating with each other? These things are fascinating to me. I want to do a little commercial quickly for some other people in the English department who do rhetorical studies or have just recently been with us and doing rhetorical studies, but not necessarily with the big R word in their names on their CVs. Angelita DeBordine, for example, is doing a course next semester in the fall on the rhetoric of race, and I want to be on the front seat, because that's exactly the kind of rhetorical study that I think is lively and important for our students now. compositionists such as Irvin Peckham, who talked about expressionism, how meaning comes from the personal, from the individual. Now, a lot of us could deconstruct the individual and get rid of the individual, but Irvin believed passionately in the power of expressionism, and I miss that. And so we've got to have some other people take up that banner. Sarah Liggett talks about the rhetoric of the writing program, the writing center, how all of that works. Barbara Heffron ran the university writing program, has a rhetorical foundation, and does medical rhetoric as her individual scholarly work, and is away doing a book, as she'll be talking through today. Sue, who's going to talk in just a few minutes, is also really lively and active in the graduate program that we have, and she teaches community literacy, diversity, whatever. You should speak for yourself, Sue. People whose work comes out of the rhetorical tradition per se, and I would say that mine certainly does. I began my career 40 years ago, you can do the math, with composing processes, with studying how writers actually write. And I did that for a while, and I've always been a closet techie, always been involved with computers. So I studied how writers wrote with computers and all of that kind of thing. But after a while, I learned everything I could learn that way, and I quit. And I was looking around for other ways. I'd been trained in rhetoric, so I was teaching classical rhetoric and the sweep of rhetoric. Kept doing that for a while until about the 80s. And then I said, wait a minute. That's when the rhetoric of domination just swept over me, and I can't tell you how important it was. It seemed to me that in literature, in art, in music, whatever the fields were in the academy in the 80s, we were all saying, this canon is so restricted and so narrow, it represents only a certain kind of Western culture, and we need to open it up. We need to open up the lens. So my particular way of doing that was to say, okay, rhetoric is domination. How has anybody who is dominated ever used rhetoric to their advantage? And of course the answer is yes. You can't look at the suffragists, you can't look at the early feminists, you can't look at, well, I could go on with the list. They used traditional rhetorical strategies to fight domination. But then that wasn't enough for me and a lot of other people in the 80s. We wanted to say, are there any new rhetorics out there that are outside the canon? Should we be bringing other things in? And another thing that we did was we said, let's reread this canon and see if we can see it any differently. So I brought one of my friends along, Cheryl Glenn, rereading Rhetoric Retold by Cheryl Glenn. She was in the middle of all of this and just basically looked at the sweep of the canon and said, you know, I'm going to read this differently. And that was another strategy that people used. I've got some other friends. Oh, I brought Cicero in Latin for any of you who still want to read the canon. I love doing it. I will never stop. But it's not always for the same reason that I did in the beginning. Okay, I'm working my current work now. I know I don't have a lot of time. How am I doing, Wade?
Good.
All right. That's the answer I wanted. My current work takes me back to my techie days in a way, because I am absolutely interested in the effects of digital technology on literacy. But because of the historical background that I have, I can't start, you know, with the year 2000. I have to go all the way back. In my case, to Plato. I can't start before that, because the arguments about the ways we read and write have been there from the very beginning. And some of the graduate students in here are saying, oh no, she's going to talk about the Phaedrus again. And she's going to talk about Toth and all of that, which I do. And Toth is right here for your viewing pleasure. There he is. He supposedly invented writing, and it was a big problem for Plato because he didn't believe in writing. And then the other thing I found out as a feminist is that there was a woman, this is Toth right here, and there was a woman back there who invented hieroglyphs too, and her name is Seychant, and she doesn't get mentioned because Plato didn't mention her. So